So let us get on to the really quite bold statement of this morning's discussion, how to avoid a 21st century Great Depression. And before I get on to that, I will say that there are kind of two questions tied up in that. Firstly, are we on the precipice of a Great Depression? We know that a recession is two quarters of falling activity, but a depression is something that is much longer, that runs over multiple countries. And because we've had the fall that we've had, the OBR has just told us yesterday that in the UK alone we fell by 25%, a number that it took 18 years of growth to get up to. So really, if you can, I'm going to bring you all to answer that really question in two parts. One is, are we on the precipice potentially of a Great Depression? And if we are, what ways can we avoid that? And I'm going to go first, and I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly what order I said I'd come to you in, and I'm going to come straight to you, Tom. I think it was you. So I'll give you a couple of minutes each to answer that question.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, we're certainly in the middle of a very deep recession, as evidenced yesterday by the GDP numbers for May in the UK. I think we'll avoid a Great Depression, and I think that's a fairly remote possibility for a couple of significant reasons. One is the ability the UK has as a monetary sovereign, if you like, to enact very large budget deficits. Clearly not ideal, but this is the hand we've been dealt. And one of the things noted in the OBR report yesterday was that despite the large deficits, there've been, value for money, if you like, in terms of the damage that would have been done otherwise. So that has meant that the UK has been able to enact the very successful furlough program. It's meant in the US that you've had very extraordinary levels of unemployment insurance, $600 a week. The average US household is in better financial shape now than it was pre-crisis. So those things make a Great Depression in some sense a choice. So far we've chosen not to have one, as the government has chosen not to have one. I'd expect that to continue even as these programs are wound down and we move to the other side of the trade-off, if you like, which maybe I'll come to later. The other thing that is probably slightly underappreciated, in my view at least, is the legacy of 2008, the sort of belated gifts of 2008. We have a health crisis globally, we have an economic crisis. If it wasn't for the measures put in place post-2008 in terms of making the banking system more robust, we'd probably have a banking crisis now. If this happened in 2006, we'd have had a banking crisis at the same time. That would have been very hard to extinguish. The dominoes are harder to push over now and further apart, and that's very significant in terms of capital ratios. The way banks are funded is much more sensible. The other thing 2008 has given us is a policy toolkit on the monetary side that's brought as things that were unconventional kind of to become a bit more off the shelf. Quantitative easing, of course, forward guidance, these things have all helped. I think also 2008 has normalized, one of the most significant things monetary policy wise in this crisis didn't happen in 2008, which is that the Federal Reserve is buying US corporate bonds, a very underappreciated thing that short-circuited the panic at the end of March. That would have been very unconventional in 2008, but thanks to that crisis and the things we've learned, it becomes a tool that was available. So I think we'll avoid a Great Depression. The recovery, medium and long term, that's very much up for grabs in terms of how quickly or slowly that happens. But in the short term, the worst, I think it will be avoided.
Great, thank you. So cautious optimism there from Tom, and really saying that it's a choice of ours. Economics is not something that comes from nowhere. It is not a storm, and it's not a natural phenomenon. I'll just say to all our guests, we have a huge number of guests. We have about 50 or 60 in the audience. Please do put your questions in. There's a Q&A section in the bottom. Please put your question, who you are and who you work for, and I will be going through the questions after coming to all the panelists with the central question to take those questions there. If you want to provide a statement, please do so in the chat section. Janet, I'll come on to you now with the same central question.
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Janet Moy from Brewin, Dolphin. So I very much agree with Tom, what he said, actually. I think this recession is brought upon by the lockdown. So this is not initially a demand problem. So what we're seeing is a very sharp fall in activity just because people can't go out, right? So what we may see is maybe the shortest recession ever. And if we do see that, we don't see it as a Great Depression, because I think if you classify this as a Great Depression, to a certain extent, it has to be a very sustained, fall in activity, which we are not seeing that. In fact, I track economic data very closely. What we're seeing globally is that actually there are a lot of green shoots in our economic data. So I would say that we're starting to see recovery. So we're not in a Great Depression. And I think a very important point is that as Tom has briefly mentioned, we're very different from 2008, as in the banking system is actually still very robust. And I think this really distinguishes us from being in a Great Depression, because the features of a Great Depression would be a failure of the banking system where the credit flow to the real economy is stopped. But this is what not we're seeing at the moment. So we're still seeing credit flowing into the real economy. In fact, corporate can still access credit held by liquidity by the central bank. And also, if you look at the US mortgage application, it is actually still rising. And if we're in a Great Depression, we typically won't see this kind of healthy sign from the US housing market. That's really a critical part of the economy. So there are evidence that things are getting better and we're not in that kind of downward spiral. So this is good news. But having said that, we're still in a recovery, and there's still challenges, there's still uncertainty. So I think all these measures by central bank and government, they have to be kept in place, first of all. And I want to speak from the wealth management and asset management angle, because I'm from the sector. And I do believe that, we as asset managers, wealth managers, we have a role to play to support businesses in this very difficult time. And I think, we are long-term investors. So we care about the long-term value of companies. We do want to support this business if they have a viable business strategy, they have a sustainable business model. And it is very important not to let these businesses fail because of this very short-term shock. So what we think is that we as asset owners, we as shareholders, we can engage with these companies, owners, engage with their stakeholders to help them find a solution or to help them, for example, allocate a capital. So I think this could be something that we can contribute as an industry, but it is equally very important for us that what we contribute is based on the sustainability of the business. And also it is very important for this business to actually enforce on their social contract. For example, they have to treat their customers fairly, they have to treat their employees well. So it is, there are conditions attached to how we help them. So this is very much what we believe in as an industry with long-term visions.
Great. So from Janet, again, positive, seeing green shoots, including in the US housing market, but actually saying that wealth managers such as herself should really take a more active role in getting those helping those green shoots turn into green trees, if they were. Vince, sometimes you've had a more gloomy view of economic matters. How are you seeing things?
I think there are big risks, but I think I agree with the other panelists that we're not, at the moment anyway, heading to a Great Depression, mainly because governments have done the right thing. And, we've had central banks pumping in liquidity, keeping interest rates short and long-term low and indeed negative. Governments using their fiscal space where they have it to keep up family incomes and keep companies operating. So all positive. I suppose particular honors go to the US Congress and the German government. British have done well. I think slight qualification though, because there are a lot of countries that don't have fiscal space. The big countries that kept the world economy going 10 years ago, China will not see any growth this year, but it's getting through the crisis. India is in terrible shape. It was a big growth economy 10 years ago. So, you know, some negatives. The world economy, IMF figures about 5% decline this year. We've not seen that, I think, in the post-war era. And the UK, I think the current estimate is GDP will be down about 10% this year, which is twice as bad as in 2008-9, and actually twice as bad as in 1932, I think, was when we last were in this kind of territory. But it should recover quite quickly, certainly in terms of output, but not in terms of employment. Nobody's mentioned unemployment. We could have, you know, double-digit unemployment dragging on for the best part of a decade. You know, people lose contact with the labour market, they lose their skills, very bad. And I think my final point is that although we look as if we're heading in a way that avoids the worst, thanks to sensible governments, you know, there are still some big risks out there. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of fear. Things we need to think about are problems of debt deflation, a lot of companies loading up on borrowing to keep out of trouble. If that continues, they're not going to invest. You know, we see the kind of problems that they have in Japan. That could, of course, impact on the financial sector, banking. Of course, the UK is reasonably robust. Some countries have got very wobbly banks, a country like Italy, as we know about. And it's possible, we begin to see signs of this, of governments doing stupid things, actually making the problem worse. I mean, you know, US-China trade dispute, really very unfortunate. We'll get on to Brexit later, but, you know, this kind of thing, at a time when governments have generally been excelling themselves, there is the potential for damaging things. And the last point is, although governments have, I think, been pretty sensible in their fiscal policy, there is a danger of cutting off the stimulus too quickly. We're already getting signs of the UK, the Treasury is beginning to panic. And unfortunately, we're just going to have to need to run the big deficits and pile up debt for some time yet. But if markets turn sour, if the politicians panic, then the recovery might be aborted.
Great. So Vince, they're kind of pointing out really some of the things that actually happened at the Great Depression in the last century, which was, you know, tax receipts going down and then government spending going down, which brought us Keynesian economics, really, that most economists have followed over the last 100 years. But pointing out that if governments around the world do the wrong thing, such as a trade war with China and potentially Brexit, that could have serious repercussions around the world. Matthew, can I bring you in now, please?
Sure. I would say it all depends really on whether there's a second spike or a second wave. That's the crucial thing I'll be looking for. Naturally, I like to be cautiously optimistic about these things. I'm hopeful it won't happen, but that will be the key determinant. But let's just sort of play out between now and the end of the year. You know, how do we avoid the second wave in the UK? So focusing more on the UK now on all of this. A lot depends on whether the government's test and trace system is fully operational and continues to work, and crucially inspires confidence amongst people to go back to their offices and to go shopping and to boost demand in that way. So people have to have confidence in how the government's handling things. We'll be lucky at the moment that so far the spikes we've seen have been very localized, based around specific workplaces. If they become more generalized, I could see that hitting confidence and sort of damaging the economy. But you know, so far so good on that. I think the other things that are necessary when we look at the UK, first of all, is the schools reopening in September. We've all seen, I've got 2 little children, what effect schools not being open can have on productivity overall. I think we really need to make sure the schools get back. That's really important. When it comes to the autumn budget, I would echo the thoughts of other panelists in saying that the boosterism, as the government sometimes likes to call it, needs to continue. Perhaps there'll be a few further tax cuts, perhaps greater spending in certain areas. And of course, that all relies on the low interest rates and the QE continuing. So we need to see that go well. And another sort of UK point, touching on Brexit just very briefly, I think that will really affect confidence. I'm optimistic there will be a EU-UK trade deal by the end of the world, so I don't see that being a problem. But you can see how there could be a run of events where things go the wrong way. But at the moment, I'll say I'm cautiously optimistic that we're now heading out of it.
Great. I'm going to thank you very much for that, Matthew. So more cautious optimism from Matthew, but Matthew raising the very important issue, and I'd love to hear other people's views on this risk of a second spike, which looks like it could potentially happen in the winter, January, February, March. So, these could be the good times that we're looking at now. So we might need to make the most of them. I'm going to take a question from a ex-lobby colleague, friend of mine, David Henke of Byline Times. Great to have you, David, former Guardian journalist. What is the panel's view on the recovery being based on retail spending and services when for a long-term recovery we need to boost manufacturing and innovation for high-skilled long-term jobs? And I'll just add to that, this morning we had a letter in the Telegraph and the Independent from I think 17 UK manufacturers asking for Britain to spend more on UK manufacturing, of which Heap and Partners was one of those signatories. Would anyone like to take that question from David Henke?
Well,
Yes, I can take.
Sorry, Janet,
Oh.
go ahead.
Just a brief one. So I think, the UK economy is very highly based on services sector. That is not going to change. So it is very important to support that economy. And I think, that's why the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, he's quite nailed on supporting, traineeship and apprenticeship, because it is very important to get these young workers in the right sector and provide them with the right training. So I think that's the right direction, at least going forward. But I do think that we do need more investment in the innovative and the technology sector, because I feel that the UK is sort of lagging in this sector compared to, say, the US or China.
Great, Vince, I'll bring you in as well.
Just add a word. I mean, the question is sort of rhetorical. I mean, it's obviously the case that the recovery is retail-led. I mean, having presided over industrial strategy for 5 years, I mean, it was difficult enough at the better times, but I just can't see where the investment and innovation in the private sector is going to come from in the foreseeable future. I mean, it'll happen in due course, but not much sign of it. I mean, what's really missing, I think, from the British policy mix is a very clear steer on public investment. Boris Johnson used the right language, build, build, build. But Sunak's comments last week really didn't add very much. I just don't see the investment coming through. And if it's going to happen, it's going to have to be public-private partnership and public sector-led. It's not happening at the moment.
Great. I'll do another question from the audience, unless Matthew and Tom, you wanted to come in on that one. One question is, what type of new taxes do you think we should see from the government? I'll put that first to Matthew, as a former Taxpayers Alliance CEO.
Of course. I think it would be a very bad sign in the autumn budget if the government started bringing in new taxes, just as hopefully at that point we'll be seeing some renewed economic growth. And certainly, talk has been floating around of having, for example, a wealth tax. I saw the LSE did a big study on that with a forward by Gus O'Donnell. And there's chat at the moment, whether or not Labour Party support it or not, and that's an active debate. The Conservative Party certainly don't support it. But I think if we're going to show that the UK is a place to invest, a place that welcomes entrepreneurs and job creators, hammering the wealthy wouldn't be a way forward on that front. So I can't see, I think it'd be a big mistake to start hiking taxes in the autumn.
Right, so that's a no for the capital gains tax increase from Matthew. Vince, do you have a view on this?
Well, I agree with Matthew. We shouldn't be looking at higher taxes in the autumn, and there are areas where we should probably be looking at cuts in taxes, like employers' national insurance. But I think, the concept of wealth tax is, it's quite emotive. I mean, there are many, I agree with Matthew, we don't want to be discouraging entrepreneurs and, any changes in capital gains tax and profits tax that discourage business, we really don't want that. But of course, there is a lot of wealth accretion through the property market, which is not remotely productive. And if they can find a way of shaping capital gains tax or other capital taxes in a way that taxes unproductive property appreciation but leaves genuine risk taking alone, that would be welcome, I think.
John, I'll make one point on this. I'm obviously not a policy guy. I think the only thing I'd say is if I look at the UK economy, the US economy, one of the problems, certainly as I perceive it, is assets and this is a problem of economic growth. One of assets concentrated in hands of those with very low marginal propensity to consume. How that, and by that I mean if you give someone with no assets some assets, they're more likely to spend them than someone with a lot of assets already. How you solve that is very problematic. It may be inflation, it may be wealth tax. I'm not sure, but that is an issue that ideally would be solved somehow. The other question I suppose is in the post-crisis, post-pandemic era, with evidence that the government is able to run such large deficits, whether or not there'll be appetite for another slow, drawn-out, shallow recovery in the public, whether that it will result in a structural change on that side is something we're considering.
Great. I'm going to take another question from the audience. Jacob Metcalf has asked about face masks, which is an issue that's come up with some people believing that needing to wear face masks in shops will be a drag on the economy, and others saying that it will actually make people feel safer. Does anyone have a view on face masks? And let's extend that to the workplace as well.
Well, this is an area where scientific advice hasn't been terribly helpful. I mean, generally we defer to scientific advice, absolutely right. But I think in this area, they've been a bit inconsistent and the politicians have been embarrassed as a result of it. I mean, I think this is essentially a sort of courtesy thing rather than a public health thing, but I can't see that it could do any harm. And if you're going to do it, you're going to do it consistently. And I have absolutely no problem with the idea of, wearing it on a compulsory basis. I do it on a voluntary basis anyway.
Yeah, I have very strong feelings on that. I think there is evidence that, for example, in places like Asia, China, where the wearing of face masks is mandatory and is very strictly enforced, there is evidence that actually is working to protect the people. And I think, as Vince has mentioned, it is actually, there's no ill intention. It is actually to protect the public. So I think it should be supported and it should be enforced, especially as we are worried about a second wave.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. What that would do if we're all locked down again come January, February, March. Not least, as Matthew says, for all our mental health if we got children or even if we don't have children. I'm going to take a question from Craig Beaumont, who's the Chief of External Affairs at the Federation of Small Businesses. There was a lot in the Chancellor's statements about job retention and saving jobs, but not much about job creation. It's no cheaper to recruit someone now than it was before last week. Should we make it cheaper to employ people to help shorten the recession, such as reducing employer NICs? I'd like to take that from anyone, but I'm sure Vince and Matthew might have views on that one.
Yes, it is a direct way to provide an incentive to hire. It's quite an expensive policy because a lot of people would hire additional people without being supported by the government to do it. But yeah, I mean, if you're going to use tax measures, that clearly is the best direct way of doing it. I think the one thing we should be careful about, however, is the kind of traditional classical view of the labour market, which we, I think, all had till quite recently. I certainly carried it around in government, that you get people back into work by cutting real wages. I mean, that I think we now know is a rather bad idea. And we want to see real wages rising and workers spending more.
Great. Matthew?
I'm also a fan of cutting employers' NI. Perhaps just one other thought in this area. All of us have had different lockdown experiences. For me, a lot was taken up with childcare. For other people, they've been writing the book they've always been thinking about. But for other people, they've been sort of thinking about the business they've always wanted to create. There are lots of budding entrepreneurs out there, I think, with good business ideas. And I think a lot of the growth to power us out of this recession could come from those new businesses, the creation of micro businesses and then hopefully SMEs. So I hope the government will look at basically how it can encourage entrepreneurship, new business setup, and let's get some job creation from those new businesses.
Great. Janet, Tom, do you have any different views you want to add in? Great. I will take another question from the. Actually, I'm going to go into a question that I'd like to ask. So Vince did mention earlier about some of the steps that countries are taking around the world. One of them, for us in the UK anyway, is kind of Brexit looming large in what have we got left? 5.5 months or so. What's your view of the effect that Brexit will have, Vince?
Well, I don't want to rehearse all the old arguments which we've been boring each other to tears with the last 5 years. I think it's probably quite likely, actually, that they will patch together some minimalist agreement to prevent really disastrous things happening. So, they're not going to reach an ambitious trade agreement, but I suspect that, the cliff edge will be mooted to some extent. I mean, the worry I have about it is well, actually, it goes back to your last question for the Federation of Small Business, that, vast amounts of unnecessary, irritating, form-filling uncertainty at a time when, business needs these things like a hole in the head, and it's going to act as a drag on recovery and optimism when it should be the opposite. And I see no sign of these new agreements coming through that are going to reinvigorate our exporters. I mean, we've already pretty much turned our back on China, which is the biggest emerging market. India, there's very little going to happen. Where everything now hinges on an agreement with the United States, with an unreliable president who may not be re-elected anyway. So, the whole story is it's sort of negative, but I don't want to talk about catastrophe. That kind of extreme predictions are probably not what we're talking about here.
And Matthew, I take it you may have a different view.
I'll echo Vince. I don't want to rehearse the old arguments again, but a couple of points. On the trade point, it is worth thinking about the accession to the CPTPP. That would be a significant deal for the UK. That'd be useful. For me, Brexit was always about trade and Britain being a sort of more global country. And I think one reassuring thing I hope people will take from Boris Johnson's administration is his approach to migration. Now, of course, this week we've heard about the points-based system. Also, we've had the announcement in recent weeks about the government being willing to give passports to people from Hong Kong. To me, that's a very, very positive sign. That shows a country where we want to get the best and the brightest coming to the UK. We want to be an open country, an international country. So Boris Johnson's administration won't be doing the insular, inward-looking, pulling at the drawbridge Brexit that some people were fearing.
Great. I'm going to take what's an excellent question from Matthew Milligan, who's the communications officer for Maria Caulfield MP, the Conservative MP for Lewis. He said that there's been lots of talk of a V-shaped recovery, what's the panel's view on when GDP will recover to pre-COVID levels? And as I pointed out at the beginning, it's now back to where it was 18 years ago. Janet, you were kind of bullish on this, so let's take your view.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm bullish. I'm cautiously optimistic. So basically, I think it will take at least a few years because when you look back at 2008, the UK took 5 years to get back to the pre-crisis level. That's 5 years. And right now we're seeing a deeper trough, but equally we could be seeing a faster recovery than 2008 because that was fundamentally more financial crisis. So I think at least a few years, just because of the arithmetic, because we're coming from such a low base. So it does take quite a while, but it really depends on, how businesses are coping, if jobs are being, back, if we create new jobs. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but my best guess is it will take at least a while. Yeah.
Tom?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's something quite unique about this crisis and something quite different to 2008, which is that the unemployment and the lack of economic activity has been sort of government mandated in order to avoid a health crisis. I think the question about when we get back to where we were depends on two things. One is the kind of scarring that's done, and two is the structural changes that occur. So on the scarring point, this is the restaurant that doesn't just stop operating during this period, it actually shuts down, and when people can go back to restaurants with the same level of demand as before isn't there anymore. And those types of things, which the furlough scheme and government support programs hopefully help. But it's unclear. The second one is the structural changes. So all the people that are furloughed, if I create a kind of fictional world where all businesses are kind of kept on life support and ready to re-emerge, and all of our consumption habits go back to where they were previously, everybody that used to work in the cinema would need to go and work in the cinema again. Everybody that works in the gym would need to go work in the gym again. Likewise, another construct would be a world that stays like this forever and all those people never go back to work. Clearly, the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle. I'm probably more optimistic for something closer to the former. And I don't think this is a comparable crisis to 2008 for that reason. This has been a government mandated economic shutdown, not a misallocation of capital in the private sector or some kind of a mistake. So I put myself probably at the more optimistic side of that discussion.
Matthew, Vince, are either of you, are both of you as optimistic as the OBR?
I broadly agree with that. Of course, one of the big differences with the crisis 10 years ago is the fact that then there was massive credit constraint. I mean, small business and medium-sized businesses simply couldn't get access to capital. It's a key problem, which is not the case at the moment. No, I think the conventional assumption is that we're talking about U-shaped rather than V-shaped recoveries, and probably double U rather than double V is probably the kind of profile we're talking about. If in my more pessimistic moments I see an L, when all kind of problems come over the horizon. But I think we could reasonably assume that with bumps up and down, 3 years time, we're probably back to the same level of production, but we won't be back to the same level of employment. That's going to hang around for quite a bit longer.
Great. Another question from the audience. David Miller, Managing Director of Heap and Partners. Do the panel think that some of the redundancies currently being made are structural changes that were needed regardless of COVID-19, such as a move of businesses from the high street to the internet? Let me know if anyone wants to take that first.
Yeah, I think so, because I think what we see in the COVID-19 is that a lot of these trends, which is already happening before COVID-19, by the way, it's just got accelerated. So what it may take, it would have taken 10 years, and now it may take just 3 years, but it is happening. So for example, what we're seeing is for example, the commercial property side is failing, like the high street retailers, because people are shopping online more, and COVID-19 is just going to change that habit. So I think sectors like that would be at risk as more and more people move online. And I think that is really important that the government identifies who is the most at risk from this sort of structural change. For example, it will be the younger people, for example, that are more likely to be in these sort of sectors, and they're more likely to be made redundant. And that's why they are actually nailed on, you know, providing training to these young people for them to transition into the right sector post COVID-19.
Would anyone like to add to that?
I think, you know, most of us are likely to agree with that. I mean, there is going to be a massive challenge in re-employment because, I mean, the recovery from the financial crisis was brilliant in terms of employment, but disastrous in terms of productivity. We had virtually no productivity growth and therefore no growth in real wages. And this time, there is kind of enforced, you know, productivity improvements. But the people who are displaced by that are going to have to be helped. You know, I mean, there are all kinds of ways we can do it. You know, a lot more support for adult education and retraining. You know, the kind of schemes that Rishi Sunak was talking about last week. But we're going to think much, much more about re-employment. And some of the ideas of the 80s, I think, are going to come back.
Great. Let's just talk about Britain in the wider global economy. How well placed do panelists, maybe I can bring you in at this point, Matthew or Tom,
sure,
on how well placed the UK is compared with other big economies around the world, and how well insulated we are to deal with, how we were insulated at the start of this to deal with the shock?
Perhaps I'll kick off on this. I was very optimistic about our situation at the beginning of the year. We'd had a number of years with the Brexit uncertainty. There had been uncertainty, and it had reduced investment. It suppressed investment in the economy. But it really felt that in January, things were starting to roar back after a very decisive general election victory by Boris Johnson, and also the prospect of leaving on the 31st of January. So things are coming back in a very big way. And I think that what investors spotted was a country where there was a stable government, a government that would possibly have even 2 terms in office, a government that was very pro-business, free market, free trading and the like, and also one which had a global outlook. It wanted these trade deals. It wasn't the sort of Little Englander Brexit type of government that some people had painted as being. So things were looking very rosy at the beginning of the year. It was obviously then cut off with the crisis. But if we can encourage that investment to come in and really show that Britain is sort of the place to do business, that the Brexit uncertainty is gone, we want to be a global free trading country, welcoming investors and entrepreneurs, then I think the growth could really come back. But that's how we need to sort of shape ourselves.
And is that how we're shaping ourselves, Vince?
Well, I mean, I disagree with a lot of that. But the one thing I just want to focus on in terms of external vulnerability is the sovereign debt issue. This obsessed the government I was part of. We were terrified we would get over what was seen as a 90% threshold for public debt, and markets would panic. And although we could devalue, unlike Italy and Greece, it was still very vulnerable. And I think there's a big question about how strong the UK really is deep down if there is a wave of panic in financial markets. I mean, we're clearly not in the position of Japan and the United States that we can borrow in our own currency. We can't do that. And we're not as secure as countries like Germany in terms of underlying kind of national balance sheet. We're in a kind of middle of the road position. And if, with waves of a pandemic, not just a second wave, if things go bad in other respects, the end of the year, we could see serious discomfort coming from capital markets, and then the government being forced to retrench, and all kind of difficulties coming from that. I wouldn't say that's bound to happen, but I think it's a risk we need to be a bit conscious of. And there may be people in the panel with market experience who have a sense of how the bond markets are going to look at the UK under different scenarios.
I'll come in there if that's okay, John.
Yeah.
Look, I think the recent history of the bond market is to price in the forward path of interest rates in the UK. And I personally would expect that to continue. You know, the UK has its own currency. It has the ability to create that currency and to do with it as it chooses. So in that sense, the bigger constraint, as I would see it, would be inflation. That's not the environment we're in. I don't think that's the environment we're going to be in for a while. So I'm probably less concerned about that. And I just draw a slight distinction between ourselves and Southern Europe, say, that don't have their own currency. They don't have the ability to do the things that we can do. And if you look at how those instruments behave, so if I think about the UK government bond yields, in times of stress, they tend to go down, and good times, they tend to go up as they reflect the forward path of interest rates. Italian yields and Spanish yields behave a little bit more like a company. When things get bad, those yields go up and you get in a sort of bad cycle. And when things get good, those yields go down. So far, the mutualization measures in Europe have been enough. And I'd expect, you know, as has been the case since 2011, as and when the mutualization needs to be ramped up, it will be. But no, I'm probably more relaxed about that. And as I said, I think the constraint on a sovereign with its own currency would be inflation, and we're in a all things equal, a slightly disinflationary environment. So I'm less concerned personally.
Yeah, so can I add something? So I agree with what Tom is saying. So I just want to add that, you know, I think from a market participant point of view, I think the UK actually relatively has more autonomy, not just the monetary policy, but also the fiscal side. Because if you look at what the European Union are doing, they want to have that recovery fund, right? 750 billion recovery fund. That is still in discussion because they need to get consent from all the member states. So this is something that the UK, at least we don't have that constraint. And I think that is really helpful.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question from the audience. Beatrice Hoser, I hope I pronounced that correct, from the University of Glasgow, has asked, will businesses not be taking advantage of the crisis to streamline? And that's streamlining in two different ways she's worried about. Firstly, replacing humans with technology. And secondly, taking advantage of the fact that if you have people working from home, well, you might as well have people working from a cheaper country, such as potentially India or someone else. So that could potentially affect UK employment figures. Would anyone like to answer that one? Anyone with a finger on the pulse of what businesses are trying to do?
I don't have a finger on the pulse, but just to attempt an answer to the question. I mean, I don't see a great deal of scope for capital deepening at the moment because businesses are unlikely to get involved in heavy investment under the current environment. But in terms of overseas, I think that there is a lot of fashionable talk about the end of globalization. I think that's nonsense. There are many respects in which companies will continue to operate as global companies. The current divestment from China, which is probably exaggerated, may simply result in switching to Vietnam and Thailand. So I think, yeah, there will be a continuing search for low cost but high productivity labour.
And actually, I've got a very good example of one of those things. Last night, I was with a barrister friend who said that he had a case that would have been an open and shut in Nottingham Crown Court yesterday, that would have taken him travelling all the way to Nottingham, spending 5 minutes, saying perhaps no more than 100 words, and then coming back again. And that, as a self-employed person, would have cost him all that money, and instead it was done on Zoom. So I do wonder if some of those big business meetings that people have been taking over the years, other parts of the world and stuff, might actually go out of the window. Good. I'm going to take another question from Al Gaff, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the Open Rights Group. He is asking, sorry, let me just get to this. So employment rights are rightly recognised, he says, as an issue that could linger for some time. What does the panel think about adopting the Nordic model of flexicurity, aimed at supporting individuals rather than jobs? And this is to prevent double-digit unemployment figures and a lost generation of the 1980s. Vince, you look keen to...
Well, I'm a great fan of the kind of Scandinavian model, but of course it requires acceptance of significantly higher levels of taxation than the British have traditionally voted for. I mean, if it was left to me, I would certainly vote for it. But in terms of labour markets, I mean, the way that the Swedish and other economies operate is that they deliberately sacrifice, low wage, low productivity employment. They drive up wages and they drive out what they regard as poor jobs. Now, that's all very well if you're starting from a good position and something close to full employment, but we're well away from that. But in the long term, yeah, I mean, the idea of much more intensive training and retraining is obviously right. We should have been doing that for decades and we haven't. And the core of it, I think, is the point that Gavin Williamson acknowledged, but he hasn't followed up, which is to make sure that the further education sector is properly supported and funded.
Great. And does anyone else want to come in on that one about kind of flexible jobs and how to support the jobs in that way? No, I'll move on to an issue that we've just really touched on, which is kind of the US-China tensions, and really what some commentators have mentioned over the months of lockdown is more of a retrenchment of countries, moving away from what we've seen over the past 10 or 15 years, which is just increased internationalism. Does anyone want to come in on what they think, where we're sitting as a kind of global citizens at the moment in terms of protectionism, and whether those kind of some of those protectionist tendencies that we're seeing in the US and other places can be beaten, or whether countries are going to retrench and start and trade less with each other? Matthew, you've expressed some views over the trade deals that we can maybe get with other countries.
I think there's one key thing to look out for is the role of the World Trade Organization. And I think it's fair to say that in recent years, their position has been undermined, not least by the tensions between the US and China. And I hope when it gets its new Director General, they do their best to reinvigorate it, so the sort of rules-based world trading system can be stood behind by the governments. I think a lot depends on what happens with the US presidential election. I think that if President Biden gets in, I can see him making great efforts to push for international trade, more so than perhaps Donald Trump. But again, I think it depends on what happens with the UK as well. In Liz Truss at the Department for International Trade, you have a great free trader there who is keen to have lots more deals right across the world, and that's an invigorating force. I hope that countries recognise that the way out of the recession we're currently in is not to retrench, not to retreat, not to become less globalised, but to trade with each other.
Can I say something on the geopolitical tension? So I think, the point on physical trade is spot on. I think there's another implication, which is mainly US-China actually, is the tech war. So I think COVID-19, obviously there's a lot of anti-China rhetoric because of that, and then because as a result of COVID-19, actually there has been such fast acceleration in the structural trend in technology sector. So I think a lot of countries are going to dedicate a lot more resources into technology. And I think that is going to intensify further the already trade, like the tech war going on between US and China, the race to technology supremacy. And we're already seeing that kind of affect the UK, where the UK government is banning Huawei in its system already. And I think this is going to be an ongoing issue going forward. As a result of the COVID-19 further accelerating this trend.
Just to add a bit, I think one area where I'm afraid the current situation bears an uncanny resemblance to the 1930s is in attitudes to international trade. Trade fell by a third after the big collapse at the beginning of the 1930s. It was reinforced by Smoot-Hawley and by comparable legislation in Europe and elsewhere. And we're seeing the repetition here, and that's one of the reasons for being quite bearish, I think, about the world economy. Like Matthew, I agree with the emphasis should be on the World Trade Organization. Disappointed that it's stagnated for, well, now a decade. I think the British emphasis at the moment on lots of bilateral deals doesn't help. It's just fragmenting the world economy, and maybe realistic that that's all you can get. But actually, the emphasis should be on reviving the World Trade Organization, and the Trump administration has done terrible damage, by challenging the appellate structure and generally being disruptive. I fear, however, Biden may not be much better. One of the few things that Trump has in common with the Democrats in Congress is that they agree almost 100% on trade policy. It's now much more protectionist, very anti-Chinese in a completely irrational, paranoid way. No, I'm afraid the outlooks on trade are not good.
Great, and I can see in the chat here we've got David Miller of Heap and Partners saying that the panel have convinced him to invest more in automation at his factory in the north of England. It will be more efficient, but not good for jobs. So good. Well, I'm glad you've got something from that David. I'm going to leave with one question. I'm going to see if I can hold your feet to the fire and see if I can get you to answer this before we split. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. But firstly, can I put this to all of you? Will you put down a year, or even a date within a year, if you think it's very soon, that you think we will be back in the UK to pre-COVID levels, our GDP? And I'll put that first to Matthew.
Oh, put me on the spot. Well, I know the OBR were talking about 2024, I think, yesterday. I think providing there isn't a second spike, it could be before that. I think the fundamentals are in place for the UK to be able to bounce back. The government's doing the right things on the economic front. They'll be reinforced with the autumn budget. Like I was saying, the fundamentals about the UK having a strong government that's pro-business, free trading, they're all in place to encourage all the investment that was pent up and waiting to come in at the beginning of the year. So I'm more optimistic than the OBR, and would be hopeful we'll get back to those sort of levels by, let's say, 2023.
Great, Janet. 2023.
Yes, I share the same view, actually. I just think that, saying 2021 or 2022 is probably a bit too premature because we come from a very low base.
Sure.
So I think that, if the economy is on track, but if it's not satisfactory, I am quite confident that the government, not just the UK, but the global government will also continue to stimulate the economy. And that is one assumption that I'm having. That's why I'm quite cautiously optimistic. It's really based on, the massive liquidity and the continual ongoing support from government that I hope we're getting to a recovery by 2023.
Great. So Matthew and Janet both going 1 year ahead of the OBR median forecast, which is 2024. Tom, have you got a different view, or are you in the same place?
No, I would agree. I'm on the more optimistic side. I think it's going to depend on when the vaccine. I think it's a when now rather than if with the vaccine, it seems. So when that occurs, how quickly it's rolled out, and it will come down to scarring and structural changes. And I'm more on the more optimistic side on both of those. So 2023, yeah.
Great, Vince.
Yes, I think I'm part of the 2023 club. As my central forecast, but I think there is, a big downside risk as well. Good.
Well, to all of our panelists, this has been Expert Bureau from Higginson Strategy. Thank you all. You've been an excellent panel. Thank you for joining us, and some really excellent questions from the audience there.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.